The dust had barely settled on Ezra Thompson's grave when the 6 cowboys showed up at Margaret Henley's door, hats in their weathered hands and desperation in their eyes. For 30 years, she'd been the forgotten spinster of Cedar Ridge, woman who lived in the shadow of the mountains, tending her herb garden and avoiding the world that had long since written her off as too old, too plain, too set in her ways. But sometimes, the world has a way of circling back to those it forgot. And sometimes, being forgotten becomes the very thing that makes you invaluable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Henley was 48 years old the morning everything changed. Though she'd stopped counting birthdays somewhere around 35 when it became clear that counting only made the silence louder. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the September sunrise paint the Colorado peaks in shades of gold and amber, her coffee growing cold in hands that had learned to be steady through decades of solitude. The house around her was small, but immaculate, every surface scrubbed clean, every corner free of dust, as if cleanliness could somehow fill the spaces where laughter should have lived. She'd inherited it from her Aunt Cordelia 30 years ago, along with the herb garden that now sprawled across 2 acres behind the modest clapboard structure. What had started as a hobby to pass the long afternoons had become her livelihood. Her purpose, her entire world shrunk down to the careful cultivation of chamomile, lavender, echinacea, and a dozen other plants that people drove from 3 counties over to buy. Margaret moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone who had performed these same actions for over a decade. Tea first, a blend of her own mint and honey from the hive she kept at the edge of her property. Then bread, kneaded and shaped with hands that had grown strong from years of working soil and handling stubborn roots. The silence of her kitchen was broken only by the gentle bubble of water beginning to boil and the distant sound of weighing through the pine trees that surrounded her property like protective guardians. She had not always been alone. Once, there had been Samuel Morrison, the banker's son who'd courted her when she was 17 and still believed that life held promises for girls like her. He'd brought her wildflowers and spoken of a house in town, children playing in a yard with a white picket fence. But Samuel had left for Denver to study law, promising to return, promising to write. The letters came for 6 months, then stopped. Word reached Cedar Ridge 2 years later that he'd married the daughter of a prominent judge, a woman with connections, with money, with everything Margaret had never possessed. After Samuel, there had been Thomas Mitchell, the traveling merchant, who'd stopped by her aunt's house regularly, bringing news from the outside world and a smile that made Margaret's heart skip in ways she thought it had forgotten how to do. Thomas spoke of taking her away from Cedar Ridge, of seeing the ocean, together, of adventures beyond the mountain passes. But Thomas, too, had moved on, marrying a widow in Santa Fe who owned a successful boarding house and could offer him the kind of stability that a young woman with nothing but an herb garden could not provide. By the time Margaret turned 30, the invitations to weddings had stopped coming. The young men of Cedar Ridge had found wives, farmers' daughters with dowries, merchants' daughters with connections, or mail-order brides with the courage to start fresh in a new place. Margaret had become what small towns inevitably create. The spinster, the woman who had somehow missed her chance, who had been passed over so many times that people stopped seeing her as a woman at all and began viewing her as a fixture, like the old oak tree in the town square or the weathered bench outside Henley's general store. The transformation from woman to invisible fixture had been gradual, almost merciful in its slowness. First, men stopped tipping their hats when they passed her on the street. Then, women stopped including her in their afternoon gatherings, their discussions of children and husbands creating an invisible barrier that Margaret couldn't cross. Finally, even the children had stopped noticing her, except as the strange lady who grew plants and sometimes gave them peppermint sticks when their mothers weren't looking. But invisibility, Margaret had learned, came with unexpected freedoms. No longer concerned with appearances or social expectations, she'd thrown herself into her work with the herbs. She studied every book she could order from Denver, experimented with combinations and preparations, developed remedies that actually worked. When Mrs. Patterson's rheumatism flared up, it was Margaret's willow bark tea that brought relief. When the Hendricks baby couldn't sleep, Margaret's chamomile blend saved entire nights of exhaustion. When old Doc Morrison Samuel's uncle admitted privately that he was baffled by certain ailments, he quietly sent patients to the woman at the edge of town who seemed to understand plants in ways that medical school had never taught him. Her reputation spread slowly by word of mouth and whispered recommendations. People drove from Durango, from Grand Junction, sometimes from as far as Denver, seeking remedies that modern medicine couldn't provide. They came sheepishly at first, apologetically, as if buying herbs from a spinster was somehow beneath their dignity. But they came back, and they brought others, until Margaret found herself with more business than she'd ever imagined possible. The money she earned went into expanding the garden, improving the house, and building the large greenhouse that now dominated her backyard like a crystal cathedral dedicated to growing things. She'd learned to be completely self-sufficient, growing her own food, preserving her own vegetables, even raising chickens for eggs and the occasional Sunday dinner. The isolation that had once felt like punishment had become her sanctuary, a place where she could work and think and live, without the constant reminder of what she'd never had. Margaret had convinced herself that she was content with this life, more than content fulfilled. She had her work, her books, her quiet evenings by the fire. She had the satisfaction of helping people, of creating something valuable with her own hands. She had independence, which was more than many women could claim in 1887. She had peace, which she told herself was worth more than passion, stability more valuable than love. But contentment, like a carefully tended garden, requires constant maintenance. And sometimes, despite your best efforts, weeds of longing push through the most carefully prepared soil. This particular morning, as Margaret prepared for another day of drying herbs and filling orders, she felt the familiar pang of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't loneliness. She'd made peace with solitude years ago. It wasn't regret, exactly, because she'd learned that regret was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was more like an echo of possibility, a whisper of what if that grew louder on certain mornings when the light fell just right across her kitchen table, and she could almost imagine someone else sitting across from her, sharing the silence and the sunrise. She pushed the feeling away, as she always did, and stepped outside to check on her late-season tomatoes. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the mountains seemed closer somehow, as if they too were settling in for the long winter ahead. Margaret breathed deeply, filling her lungs with air that smelled of pine and earth and the faint sweetness of her mint patch. It was then that she heard the sound of horses approaching, not the single horse of a customer coming for remedies, but multiple horses moving at a pace that suggested urgency. She straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and saw them coming up the winding dirt road that led to her property. 6 riders, all young men, all wearing the clothes of working cowboys, dusty leather chaps, worn boots, hats that had seen too much sun and weather. They rode with the easy grace of men who'd spent their lives in saddles, but there was something in their posture that spoke of desperation, of men who'd come to the end of something and were looking for a new beginning. Margaret's first instinct was to retreat into the house. 6 strange men approaching her isolated property was cause for concern, especially for a woman living alone. But something about the way they approached, slowly, deliberately, with their hands visible and their manner respectful, kept her rooted in place. They stopped at her gate, the wooden barrier she'd built more for marking boundaries than for security, and the one who appeared to be their leader dismounted. He was tall and lean, with the kind of sun-weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His hat was in his hands before his boots touched the ground. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the small distance between them. "Would you be Miss Margaret Henley?" Margaret's throat felt suddenly dry. No one had asked for her by name in months, perhaps years. People usually just described her as the herb woman or the spinster at the edge of town. "I am," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Young man took a step forward, then seemed to think better of it and remained by the gate. "Ma'am, my name is Jake Sullivan. These here are my friends Ben Carter, Luke Morrison, Tom Whitfield, Sam Rodriguez, and Danny O'Brien." Each man nodded as his name was spoken, their faces serious beneath the brims of their hats. "We've just come from Ezra Thompson's funeral," Jake continued, and Margaret's heart skipped. She'd known Ezra, the old rancher who'd owned the sprawling Double T Ranch 15 miles south of town. He'd been one of her best customers, buying her remedies for everything from his arthritis to his horse's various ailments. A good man, honest and fair, who'd treated her with more respect than most. "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said quietly. "Ezra was a fine man. Yes, ma'am, he was. And that's why we're here." Jake shifted his weight, glancing back at his companions as if drawing strength from their presence. "You see, Miss Henley, Mr. Thompson left us his ranch. All of us together, but there's a condition." Margaret waited, sensing that whatever came next would change something fundamental about her carefully ordered world. Jake cleared his throat. "The will says we can only inherit if one of us is married within 60 days. To a woman of good character, someone who can help run a proper household, someone who understands the land and the work." He paused, his eyes meeting hers directly. "Mr. Thompson, he spoke of you often, ma'am. Said you were the smartest, most capable woman in 3 counties. Said any man would be lucky to have you as a wife, and any woman would be fortunate to have the security and respect that comes with being married to a good, hard-working man." The words hung in the air between them like morning mist, impossible and fragile. Margaret felt the ground beneath her feet shift slightly, as if the earth itself was adjusting to accommodate this new possibility. "What exactly are you asking me, Mr. Sullivan?" she managed to say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Jake looked back at his companions one more time, then returned his gaze to her. "Ma'am, we're asking if you'd consider choosing one of us to marry. We know it's unusual, and we know you don't know us well. But we're all good men, hard workers, and we'd treat you with nothing but respect and kindness. You'd have security, a home, a place of honor as the lady of one of the finest ranches in Colorado." He gestured toward his friends. "We figured, we hoped, that maybe you'd be willing to get to know us, to let us prove ourselves to you. And then, if you're willing, to choose which one of us you'd like to spend your life with." Margaret stared at them, these 6 young men who had appeared at her gate like something from a dream or a fairy tale. She thought of her empty house behind her quiet evenings, her careful contentment that required such constant tending. She thought of Ezra Thompson, who had seen something in her that she'd almost forgotten existed, and for the first time in 30 years. Margaret Henley began to wonder if the life she'd built around solitude might not be the only life available to her after all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the wooden gatepost, her knuckles white against the weathered pine. The 6 cowboys remained motionless on their horses, waiting for her response with the patience of men accustomed to dealing with skittish livestock. The morning air seemed to thicken around them, charged with possibility and the weight of unspoken futures. I need to understand this properly," Margaret said finally, her voice gaining strength as her shock began to settle into something more manageable. "Ezra Thompson left his ranch to all 6 of you, but only if one of you marries within 60 days? Jake Sullivan nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, ma'am." The lawyer read it out clear as day. To my 6 trusted hands, who have shown more loyalty and dedication than my own blood ever did, I leave the Double T Ranch in its entirety. This inheritance is conditional upon one of these men entering into lawful marriage with a woman of good, moral character within 60 days of my death. Should this condition not be met, the property shall be sold and the proceeds donated to the Denver orphanage. Ben Carter, a stocky man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair at his temples, spoke up. Mr. Thompson was particular about that. Part, Miss Henley, a woman of good moral character. He said most of the available ladies in Cedar Ridge were either too young and flighty or already spoken for. But he always spoke highly of you. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. In 30 years of spinsterhood, she'd grown unaccustomed to being discussed as a potential wife by anyone, let alone a group of men young enough to. Well, perhaps not young enough to be her sons, but certainly younger than her 48 years. "How old are you gentlemen?" she asked, the practical part of her mind asserting itself. "I'm 31, Jake replied. "Ben here is 33. Luke's 29, Tom's 32, Sam's 30, and Danny's the youngest at 28. Margaret calculated quickly. The oldest among them was 15 years her junior, the youngest a full 20 years younger. "Don't you think you should be looking for wives among women your own age? Women who could give you children, families?" Luke Morrison and Margaret noted the surname with a pang, wondering if he was related to her long-ago suitor Samuel Stept. Forward, he was lean and dark-haired, with intelligent brown eyes and a quiet manner that suggested depth. "Miss Henley, if I may speak plainly, we've all tried that path. Some of us have been engaged, others have courted seriously. But the women, our age in these parts, well, they're looking for different things than we can offer." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Tom Whitfield, a red-haired man with an easy smile and freckles across his nose, answered. "They want store-bought dresses and houses in town, Miss Henley. They want to move to Denver or San Francisco, not spend their lives on a ranch. They see ranching as something to escape from, not something to build a life around." Sam Rodriguez, whose dark complexion and slight accent suggested Mexican heritage, added softly, "And some of us, we're not what their families had in mind." For sons-in-law, Margaret understood immediately. Even in Colorado, where the frontier demanded a certain practical equality, social prejudices ran deep. A Mexican cowboy, no matter how skilled or hardworking, would face barriers that his Anglo companions would not. Danny O'Brien, the youngest of the group, spoke up with the earnestness of youth. "Mr. Thompson always said you understood the land. Miss Henley said you could make things grow that nobody else could, that you had a gift for knowing what was needed. That's what a ranch needs, someone who understands the rhythm of the seasons, the needs of growing things." Margaret found herself studying each man's face in turn, trying to read the characters written there. Jake Sullivan had the bearing of a natural leader, confident but not arrogant, with lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as hard work. Ben Carter's gentle demeanor and graying temples suggested steadiness, reliability, the kind of man who would remember birthdays and never raise his voice in anger. Luke Morrison possessed an intellectual quality that set him apart from his companions. Something in the way he held himself suggested he was equally comfortable with books as with cattle. Tom Whitfield radiated warmth and humor, the kind of man who would fill a house with laughter and never let a day pass without finding something to celebrate. Sam Rodriguez carried himself with quiet dignity, and despite his soft speech, there was something in his posture that suggested strength, both physical and moral. Danny O'Brien had an eager, optimistic quality that reminded Margaret of herself at 18, before the world had taught her to expect disappointment. "This is highly irregular," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she recognized them as a delaying tactic rather than a genuine objection. "Yes, ma'am, it is," Jake agreed. "But then, Mr. Thompson was never one for conventional thinking. He believed in practical solutions to practical problems. "And you believe I'm a practical solution?" The men exchanged glances, and Margaret caught something in their expressions, not desperation exactly, but something close to it. These were men facing the loss of their life's work, their home, their future. The Double T Ranch represented security, purpose, belonging. Without it, they would be just another group of aging cowboys in a world that increasingly had no place for their particular skills. "Miss Henley," Ben Carter said carefully, "we believe you're a remarkable woman who deserves better than spending the rest of her life alone. And we believe any one of us would be honored to spend his life ensuring you never have cause to regret choosing him." The sincerity in his voice made Margaret's throat tighten unexpectedly. When had anyone last spoken to her with such respect, such genuine regard? When had anyone last suggested she deserved better than what she had? How would this arrangement work? She asked, surprised by her own willingness to consider their proposal. Jake smiled for the first time since they'd arrived, and the expression transformed his serious face completely. "Well, ma'am, we figured we'd ask if you'd be willing to let us visit you, get to know you properly, and let you get to know us. We could help with work around your place. I noticed your fence could use some attention, and that roof looks like it might need reinforcing before winter. We could court you properly," Tom added with a grin that revealed a slightly crooked front tooth that somehow made his whole face more endearing. "Bring flowers, take you on picnics, whatever ladies like." Margaret almost smiled at that. "And how would you gentlemen know what ladies like?" "We'd learn," Danny said promptly. "We're not afraid of hard work, and figuring out how to make you happy would be the most important job any of us ever took on." The practical part of Margaret's mind was already cataloging the advantages of such an arrangement. Security, certainly marriage to a ranch owner, would elevate her social position considerably. Companionship after 30 years of solitude, help with the heavier work around her property. The possibility of expanding her herb business with access to more land and resources. But beneath the practical considerations, something else stirred a feeling she'd thought permanently buried. The possibility of being chosen, of being valued not as a last resort or a convenient solution, but as a prize worth competing for. 60 days, you said? She asked. 57 now, Luke corrected gently. Mr. Thompson passed 3 days ago. Margaret looked at her house with its neat gardens and careful emptiness, then back at the 6 men who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she'd never quite had the courage to voice. "I'll need to think about this," she said. "It's not a decision to be made lightly." "Of course not," Jake agreed. "But Miss Henley, would you be willing to let us call on you? To give us a chance to prove we're worthy of your consideration?" Margaret felt a flutter of something that might have been excitement, though it had been so long since she'd experienced the emotion that she couldn't be certain. "You may call," she said carefully, "but I make no promises beyond that." The collective exhale from the 6 men was audible, and Margaret realized they'd been more nervous about her response than their steady demeanor had suggested. "Thank you, Miss Henley," Jake said, settling his hat back on his head. "Would this afternoon be convenient for a first visit? We could bring some supplies, help with any repairs you might need." Margaret considered. She had orders to fill, herbs to dry, her normal routine to maintain. But when had she last deviated from routine? When had she last done something simply because it might lead to happiness rather than because it was sensible and safe? "This afternoon would be acceptable," she said. "But gentlemen, you should understand, I'm not some young girl to be won with pretty words and cheap trinkets. I'm a grown woman with a life and work of my own. If any of you think marriage means gaining a servant or a decoration, you'd best look elsewhere." Jake's grin widened. "Miss Henley, any man lucky enough to win your hand would be getting a partner, not a decoration. Mr. Thompson made that very clear." As the 6 cowboys mounted their horses and rode away, Margaret remained at her gate, watching until they disappeared around the bend in the road. Only then did she allow herself to sink onto the old wooden bench beside her front door, her legs suddenly unsteady. For 30 years, she'd told herself that independence was enough, that contentment was superior to passion, that peace was more valuable than love. But watching those 6 young men ride away, knowing they would return, knowing they would compete for her attention and affection, she felt something awakening in her chest that had been dormant so long she'd forgotten it existed. Hope. Dangerous. Intoxicating, terrifying hope. Margaret Henley, the forgotten spinster of Cedar Ridge, was about to discover what it meant to be courted by 6 men who saw her not as a last resort, but as the answer to their prayers. Margaret spent the morning in a state of nervous energy unlike anything she'd experienced in decades. She found herself changing clothes 3 times, first her everyday brown wool dress, then her Sunday blue cotton, finally settling on her forest green dress with the small pearl buttons that she'd made 2 years ago but rarely wore. She told herself it was simple practicality. If 6 men were coming to help with repairs, she should look presentable. But the face staring back at her from the mirror suggested motivations far more complicated than mere propriety. Her reflection revealed a woman she'd stopped truly seeing years ago. At 48, Margaret's dark brown hair was streaked with silver at the temples, but it was still thick and lustrous when freed from the severe bun she usually wore. Her green eyes, inherited from her Irish grandmother, were as bright as ever, framed by laugh lines that had formed despite her solitary life, evidence of the joy she found in her garden and her work. Her figure, while no longer girlish, was strong and graceful from years of physical labor, and her hands, though calloused from soil and herbs, were elegant and capable. She was arranging wildflowers in a mason jar when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching, accompanied by the creak and rumble of a wagon. Through her kitchen window, she watched the 6 cowboys return, this time bringing supplies that spoke of serious intentions: lumber, roofing materials, fence posts, and what appeared to be enough food to feed a small army. Jake Sullivan took the lead again, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle. Today he wore a clean white shirt beneath his leather vest, and his dark hair was freshly washed and combed back from his angular face. The effort he'd made with his appearance was both touching and intimidating. "Good afternoon, Miss Henley," he called out as she stepped onto her porch. "We brought some materials to help with those repairs, if that's agreeable to you." Margaret nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Sullivan." The other men began unloading the wagon with practiced efficiency, but Margaret noticed how each one found a reason to tip his hat to her, to offer a greeting, to catch her eye for just a moment longer than necessary. It was like being the center of a carefully choreographed dance, and she found the attention both thrilling and overwhelming. Ben Carter approached the porch carrying a wooden crate filled with what appeared to be food supplies. "Miss Henley, I took the liberty of bringing ingredients for supper, if you'll permit me to cook for everyone this evening. I learned from the ranch cook at my last position, and I'd be honored to prepare a meal in your kitchen." Before Margaret could respond, Tom Whitfield appeared at her elbow with a bouquet of late-season wildflowers that put her own arrangement to shame. "These were growing wild near Thompson Creek," he said with that infectious grin. "Seemed a shame to let them waste away when they could brighten a lady's table." Margaret accepted the flowers, acutely aware of how her fingers trembled slightly as she took them. "They're beautiful, Mr. Whitfield, thank you." Luke Morrison had positioned himself near her garden, examining her herb plants with obvious knowledge and genuine interest. "You've got a remarkable setup here, Miss Henley," he said, straightening from where he'd been crouched beside her echinacea. "I've read about companion planting in some agricultural journals, but I've never seen it implemented so successfully. Your soil composition must be perfectly balanced." Margaret felt a flush of pleasure at his professional appreciation. Most people saw her garden as merely a collection of pretty plants. Luke clearly understood the science and skill behind her success. Meanwhile, San Rodriguez had begun examining her roof with the focused attention of an expert. "The structure is sound," he called down from where he'd climbed up to inspect the shingles. "But you've got some loose boards here that could cause problems come winter storms. We can have this reinforced before evening." Danny O'Brien had discovered her chicken coop and was already inside, apparently conducting some sort of engineering assessment. "Miss Henley," he called out excitedly, "you could double your egg production with just a few modifications to increase ventilation and nesting space. Would you like me to show you what I mean?" Margaret found herself pulled in 6 different directions, each man eager to demonstrate his particular skills and usefulness. It was overwhelming in the most wonderful way, like being the sole audience for 6 different performances, each designed specifically to win her approval. Jake seemed to recognize her slight bewilderment and took charge with natural authority. "All right, men, let's not overwhelm Miss Henley on our first day. Ben, why don't you start on that supper you mentioned? Tom and Danny, you take the fence line on the east side. Luke and Sam, tackle the roof repairs. I'll work on reinforcing." The front porch steps noticed they're starting to sag. As the men dispersed to their various tasks, Margaret marveled at their easy cooperation. Despite being in competition with each other for her hand, there was no apparent animosity or rivalry among them. They worked together like a well-oiled machine, each man's skills complementing the others. Ben Carter proved to be an exceptional cook, transforming her simple kitchen into a bustling hub of delicious aromas. He moved with quiet confidence, seasoning a large pot roast with herbs from her own garden, whipping up biscuits that were lighter than air, and creating what he called cowboy gravy that smelled like heaven itself. "You're very skilled, Mr. Carter," Margaret observed, watching him work while she prepared coffee for the men outside. Ben smiled, his gentle face creasing with pleasure. "My mother taught me the basics before she passed, and I've had plenty of practice cooking for ranch hands over the years. A man who can't cook is a man who can't take care of himself or anyone else." There was something in the way he said it that suggested deeper meaning, and Margaret found herself studying his profile as he worked. Ben Carter was not the most handsome of her suitors, nor the most dynamic, but there was something profoundly comforting about his steady presence, his obvious competence in domestic matters that most men considered beneath them. Outside, the sound of hammering and sawing created a rhythmic soundtrack to the afternoon. Margaret moved between the kitchen and the porch, bringing water to the working men, observing their different approaches to labor and problem-solving. Tom Whitfield worked with infectious enthusiasm, whistling while he dug post holes and chattering cheerfully with Danny about everything from weather patterns to horse breeding. His good humor seemed to energize everyone around him, and Margaret caught herself smiling at his silly jokes and exaggerated stories about life on various ranches. Danny O'Brien approached every task with the intensity of a scholar solving a complex equation. Watching him redesign her chicken coop with mathematical precision, creating detailed sketches before making any modifications, Margaret realized he possessed an engineer's mind trapped in a cowboy's body. His improvements were both practical and ingenious: a rotating nesting system that would make egg collection easier, ventilation adjustments that would keep the birds healthier, and a predator-proofing mechanism that was both simple and effective. Sam Rodriguez worked with quiet efficiency, and Margaret noticed that his repairs were not just functional, but beautiful. The sections of roof he reinforced looked better than the original construction, and when she complimented him on his craftsmanship, he blushed deeply and mumbled something about his father being a master carpenter in Sonora. Luke Morrison proved to be as knowledgeable about practical matters as he was about agricultural theory. Watching him work alongside Sam on the roof, Margaret saw that he possessed not only book learning, but also the ability to apply that knowledge skillfully. His suggestions for improving her rain collection system were both scientifically sound and economically feasible. Jake Sullivan supervised the work with the natural authority of a man accustomed to leadership. But Margaret noticed that he never gave orders, only suggestions and gentle guidance. When conflicts arose over the best approach to a particular repair, he mediated with diplomacy and good humor, ensuring that everyone's expertise was valued and utilized. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. Her property buzzed with purposeful activity, her kitchen filled with wonderful smells, and her usual solitude was replaced by the easy camaraderie of men who genuinely seemed to enjoy their work and each other's company. When evening approached, and the men gathered around her kitchen table for Ben's magnificent meal, Margaret experienced something she'd almost forgotten existed: the warmth of belonging to a group, of being the honored center of attention in the best possible way. "This is the finest meal I've had in years," she told Ben truthfully, savoring the tender roast beef and perfectly seasoned vegetables. Ben's face lit up like a sunrise. "It's my pleasure, Miss Henley. Cooking for someone who appreciates good food is one of life's greatest joys." As conversation flowed around the table, stories of ranch life, discussions of local politics, gentle debates about the best methods for various agricultural practices, Margaret realized she was seeing these men not as a group of desperate suitors, but as individuals with their own dreams, skills, and personalities. And for the first time in 30 years, she began to imagine what it might be like to choose one of them, to build a life with a partner who valued her not as a last resort, but as a prize worth winning. The evening ended with reluctant farewells and promises to return the next day. As Margaret watched them ride away in the gathering dusk, she touched the wildflowers Tom had brought, inhaled the lingering aromas of Ben's cooking, and admired the visible improvements each man had made to her property. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges as she attempted to truly get to know these 6 very different men who were all competing for the same ultimate prize: her heart, her hand, and her future. But tonight, for the first time in decades, Margaret Henley fell asleep not to the sound of wind and silence, but to the memory of laughter echoing through her kitchen, and the feeling that her carefully ordered world was about to become beautifully, wonderfully complicated. The second week of courtship brought an unexpected complication that no one had anticipated. The weather turned unusually warm for late September, creating what the locals called an Indian summer. The extended heat meant that Margaret's late harvest herbs required immediate attention, and several of her most important customers had sent urgent orders that couldn't wait for the usual processing schedule. Margaret found herself overwhelmed by the sudden influx of work just as she was trying to navigate the complex social dynamics of being courted by 6 men simultaneously. She stood in her greenhouse at dawn, surveying rows of chamomile that needed to be harvested before the heat wilted them, knowing that she also had 3 large orders of pain relief tinctures due to customers in Denver by week's end. It was Luke Morrison who appeared at her greenhouse door that morning, earlier than the others, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of genuine concern. "You looked tired yesterday evening," he said without preamble, offering her one of the cups. "I thought you might need this before the others arrive." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully, noticing that he'd prepared it exactly the way she liked it, strong, with just a touch of honey. The fact that he'd observed and remembered such a small detail touched her more than she cared to admit. "I have 3 days to process enough herbs to fill these orders," she said, gesturing helplessly at the overwhelming abundance surrounding them. "I usually spread this work over 2 weeks, but with the heat." Luke nodded, setting down his coffee and rolling up his sleeves. "What needs to be done first?" "You don't understand," Margaret protested. "This isn't ranch work. It requires knowledge of specific techniques, timing, proper handling." "Then teach me," Luke said simply. "I've read extensively about botanical medicine, and I'm a quick learner." What's the worst that could happen? I ruin some plants that would die anyway if you can't process them in time. His practical logic was irrefutable, and Margaret found herself explaining the delicate process of harvesting chamomile at the precise moment when the flowers held maximum potency. Luke listened with intense concentration, asking intelligent questions about flower maturity, optimal drying conditions, and the chemical properties that made timing so crucial. When the other cowboys arrived an hour later, they found Luke and Margaret working side by side in the greenhouse, their hands stained yellow from chamomile pollen. Deep in discussion about the medicinal properties of various alkaloids, Jake Sullivan assessed the situation with a leader's eye for logistics. "Looks like you folks could use some help. What can we do?" What followed was the most efficient harvest day Margaret had experienced in years. Jake organized the men into teams based on their particular skills, turning what should have been overwhelming individual labor into a coordinated group effort. Ben Carter took charge of processing the harvested herbs, his cooking experience translating perfectly to the careful timing and temperature control required for proper drying. His gentle hands and attention to detail made him naturally suited to the delicate work of preparing tinctures and extracts. Sam Rodriguez revealed an unexpected talent for carpentry that went beyond simple repairs. Noticing that Margaret's current drying racks were inadequate for the volume they were processing, he spent the morning constructing an ingenious system of adjustable wooden frames that could accommodate different herbs and different stages of the drying process. Tom Whitfield and Danny O'Brien worked as a team in the garden, with Tom's natural enthusiasm driving the physical labor, while Danny's systematic approach ensured that nothing was wasted and everything was processed in the fastest optimal sequence. As the day progressed, Margaret realized she was witnessing something remarkable. 6 men with different backgrounds and skills, learning to work together not just for their own benefit, but for hers. More than that, they were genuinely interested in her work, asking questions that went beyond mere politeness and offering suggestions that showed real understanding of her craft. "I have to ask," Margaret said, looking around at the 6 men who had transformed her overwhelming crisis into a manageable challenge. "Why aren't any of you married? You're all clearly capable, hardworking men. Surely you've had opportunities." The men exchanged glances, and Margaret sensed she'd touched on something they'd all been thinking about, but hadn't discussed openly. Jake spoke first, his usual confidence tinged with something more vulnerable. "I was engaged 3 years ago. Sarah Pemberton, the banker's daughter from Durango. Beautiful girl, sweet disposition, everything a man could want in a wife." He paused, staring at his hands. "Right up until she eloped with a traveling salesman who promised to take her to San Francisco and buy her silk dresses and opera tickets." Ben Carter cleared his throat softly. "My Mary died of consumption 2 years after we were engaged. We kept postponing the wedding, thinking she'd get stronger, thinking we had time." His voice trailed off, and Margaret saw the pain that still lived in his gentle eyes. Tom Whitfield's usual cheerfulness dimmed as he spoke. "I courted Emma Rodriguez, Sam's sister, for 2 years. But her father didn't think an Irish cowboy was good enough for his daughter. Wanted her to marry a shopkeeper, someone with a steady business in town." Sam nodded grimly. "My father thought Tom wasn't serious enough, too much of a dreamer. But the truth was, he didn't want his daughter married to anyone who wasn't Mexican. Said she needed to preserve the family traditions." He looked at his friend apologetically. "I tried to change his mind, but—" Luke Morrison spoke quietly. "I was married for 3 years to a schoolteacher from Denver. Elizabeth was intelligent, educated, everything I thought I wanted. But she hated ranch life, hated the isolation, hated everything about the West. She went back to Boston to visit her family and never came back. Sent divorce papers through a lawyer." Danny O'Brien, the youngest of the group, flushed red as all eyes turned to him. "I have never been engaged. Never even been seriously courted anyone." he looked down at his hands. Most girls think I'm too serious, too focused on my inventions and my books. They want someone who knows how to dance and make small talk. Not someone who gets excited about gear ratios and irrigation systems. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding. These weren't men who had casually avoided marriage. They were men who had tried and failed, who had loved and lost, who had been rejected for reasons beyond their control. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a deeper understanding of why they were all here, why Ezra Thompson's proposition had seemed like providence rather than desperation. They weren't just seeking wives. They were seeking acceptance, belonging, a chance to prove their worth to someone who might value their particular gifts. "I understand," she said softly, "more than you might think." And then, perhaps inspired by their honesty, she found herself sharing her own story in greater detail than she'd ever shared with anyone. She told them about Samuel Morrison, who had left her for social advancement, about Thomas Mitchell, who had found her dreams too small for his ambitions, about the gradual realization that she had become invisible to the world of courting and marriage, relegated to the category of useful spinster who could be called upon for remedies and advice, but never considered as a woman worthy of love. The hardest part, she admitted, wasn't being alone. It was accepting that I would always be alone, that I had somehow missed my chance for the kind of life other women took for granted. Jake leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Miss Henley, you didn't miss your chance, it just hadn't come yet." Luke nodded earnestly. "Any man who couldn't see your worth was blind, not you. You're the strongest, most accomplished woman I've ever met," Danny added with youthful fervor. "Those men who left you, they didn't deserve you." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at their sincere indignation on her behalf. When had anyone last been angry for her sake, defensive of her worth, protective of her feelings? As evening approached and they prepared to finish the day's work, Margaret realized that something fundamental had changed. The careful politeness of the early courtship had given way to genuine intimacy, not romantic intimacy. Exactly, but the deeper intimacy of shared vulnerability and mutual understanding. These 6 men had seen her at her most overwhelmed and had stepped in without hesitation. They had shared their failures and disappointments with her, treating her not as a potential wife to be impressed, but as a trusted friend worthy of their honesty. Ben approached her as she was packaging the last of the day's processed herbs. "Miss Henley," he said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens between us, whichever one of us you choose, if you choose any of us today, meant something to me. Working beside you, seeing how skilled and dedicated you are, being trusted with something that matters to you. It's been an honor." Margaret looked around at her greenhouse, transformed by their combined efforts from a space of overwhelming chaos into an organized, efficient workspace. More than that, it had become a space of collaboration and companionship, filled with the easy conversation and shared purpose that she'd never experienced before. "The honor has been mine," she said truthfully. "All of you." As they prepared to leave, Jake lingered at her door. "Miss Henley, we know this situation is unusual, and we know it puts pressure on you that isn't entirely fair. But I want you to understand something. We're not just competing for a wife. We're hoping to win a partner, someone who sees us as clearly as we're beginning to see you." After they left, Margaret stood in her transformed greenhouse surrounded by the fruits of their collective labor and realized that her heart was no longer safely protected by 30 years of careful independence. 6 men had worked their way past her defenses, not through grand romantic gestures, but through simple, steady demonstration of their character. And now, for the first time in her adult life, Margaret Henley faced the genuinely difficult task of choosing between worthy alternatives rather than settling for whatever crumbs of affection life might offer. The real courtship, she realized, was just beginning. The transformation of Margaret Henley from forgotten spinster to the most talked-about woman in Cedar Ridge happened gradually, then all at once. It began with Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the banker's wife and undisputed queen of local society, who happened to be visiting her dressmaker when she spotted 6 horses tied outside Margaret's property 3 days running. "It's highly irregular," Mrs. Thornton declared at the weekly ladies' auxiliary meeting, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had appointed herself guardian of community standards. A woman of Margaret Henley's age, entertaining 6 unmarried men without proper supervision. What sort of message does that send to our young ladies? The news spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed and inevitability of wildfire. By Sunday morning, every family in town knew that the spinster herb woman was somehow involved in a scandalous arrangement with 6 cowboys from the defunct Thompson Ranch. The details varied wildly depending on who was telling the story, but the core facts were salacious enough to keep tongues wagging through 3 church services and 2 community suppers. Margaret first became aware of the gossip when she arrived at the general store to purchase supplies for her expanding herb orders. The usual friendly chatter died abruptly when she entered, replaced by the kind of pointed silence that spoke louder than any accusation. Mrs. Patterson, who had praised Margaret's arthritis remedies just the week before, suddenly found the contents of a pickle barrel fascinating. Young Mrs. Henderson, who regularly purchased Margaret's sleep tinctures for her colicky baby, turned away entirely and pretended to examine bolts of fabric with unprecedented intensity. Only old Mr. Kowalski, the Polish immigrant who ran the hardware section, treated her normally, nodding politely and asking after her tomato harvest as if nothing had changed. But even his kindness felt like a small island of normalcy in an ocean of disapproval. At the counter, Mrs. Merton rang up Margaret's purchases with uncharacteristic efficiency, avoiding eye contact and conversation. When Margaret attempted to pay, the storekeeper's wife finally spoke. "I suppose you know what people are saying," Mrs. Merton said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that the other customers couldn't hear, but loud enough to ensure they knew something significant was being discussed. "I can imagine," Margaret replied with more composure than she felt. "Adelaide Thornton's been telling everyone you're running some sort of improper establishment. Says it's a disgrace to decent Christian women everywhere." Mrs. Merton leaned closer across the counter. "I told her that was nonsense, that you're as moral as any woman in town. But you know how Adelaide gets when she has her teeth in something." Margaret nodded, understanding the warning implicit in Mrs. Merton's words. Adelaide Thornton wielded social influence like a weapon, and once she decided someone had transgressed community standards, she could make life extremely difficult for the offender. The full extent of the opposition became clear when Margaret returned home to find a small delegation waiting on her front porch. Adelaide Thornton stood flanked by Reverend Marcus Doyle and Dr. Harrison Webb, the town's 3 most influential moral authorities arranged like a tribunal preparing to pass judgment. "Margaret," Mrs. Thornton began without preamble, "we need to discuss your recent associations." Margaret set down her purchases and faced the delegation with the calm dignity that 30 years of independence had taught her. "Mrs. Thornton, Reverend, Doctor, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Reverend Doyle, a thin man with thinning hair, and the perpetually worried expression of someone convinced the world was sliding toward moral collapse, stepped forward. "Miss Henley, we've received reports that you've been entertaining multiple unmarried men at your residence without proper chaperoning or oversight. As your spiritual advisor, I feel obligated to express my concern for both your reputation and your soul." Dr. Webb, a portly man who had never married, but considered himself an expert on proper social behavior, nodded gravely. "The appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as actual impropriety, Miss Henley. Surely a woman of your years understands the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest like a small hot flame. "And what, exactly, are you suggesting is improper about skilled craftsmen helping a neighbor with necessary repairs and legitimate Business needs? Don't be deliberately obtuse, Mrs. Thornton snapped, her carefully cultured facade slipping to reveal the steel beneath. 6 young men, call in daily, staying until all hours, working around your property like they own it. People are beginning to wonder what sort of arrangements you've made with these cowboys. The contempt in her voice when she said cowboys made Margaret's flame of anger burn brighter. These were the same people who had ignored her for 30 years, who had dismissed her as irrelevant, who had never once inquired about her welfare or offered friendship when she lived in complete solitude. Now that she had found companionship and happiness, they wanted to snatch it away in the name of propriety. The arrangements I make are my own business, Margaret said quietly, but with steel in her voice that matched Mrs. Thornton's. I'm a grown woman. I own my property, and I'll receive visitors as I see fit. Not if those visitors are damaging the moral fabric of our community, Reverend Doyle interjected. Margaret, I've known you since you were a child. Your parents were good Christian people who would be horrified by your current behavior. This whatever this is. It needs to stop before you bring scandal down on all our heads. It was at that moment that Jake Sullivan's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Afternoon, Miss Henley. I hope we're not interrupting anything important. All 6 cowboys had arrived together, and Margaret realized they must have seen the delegation's horses and approached with deliberate purpose. They stood in a loose line behind the 3 visitors, their presence transforming the dynamic entirely. What had been 3 authority figures intimidating one isolated woman suddenly became 3 nervous officials facing 7 determined people who clearly stood together. Jake's tone was polite, but his eyes were hard as flint. Is everything all right here, Miss Henley? Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Thornton wheeled to face the cowboys, her outrage finding a new target. You men are the cause of this entire unseemly situation. Decent cowboys would find wives among appropriate women of their own age and station, not prey upon lonely spinsters who don't know any better. The silence that followed was dangerous. Margaret saw Jake's jaw tighten, watched Ben's gentle face harden into something considerably less gentle, noticed how Tom's usual cheerfulness evaporated entirely. But it was Luke Morrison who stepped forward, his intellectual manner giving his words additional weight. Ma'am, he said with icy politeness, I believe you've misunderstood the situation entirely. We are not preying upon anyone. We are courting. Miss Henley, with the utmost respect and propriety, with the hope that one of us might be fortunate enough to win her hand in marriage. Marriage? Dr. Webb sputtered. 6 men cannot marry 1 woman. The very suggestion is absurd. No, sir. Sam, Rodriguez said quietly, his accent thicker than usual with suppressed emotion. 1 man hopes to marry her. We are simply allowing Miss Henley the dignity of choice that every woman deserves. Danny O'Brien, his youthful face flushed with indignation, added, Miss Henley is the most accomplished, intelligent, and moral woman in this entire county. Any man would be honored to court her properly. This is preposterous, Mrs. Thornton declared. Margaret is nearly 50 years old. The time for courtship and marriage has long passed. These men are clearly taking advantage of her loneliness and desperation. It was too much. Margaret felt 30 years of accumulated hurt and dismissal crystallize into cold, pure anger. How dare you, she said, her voice cutting through the afternoon air with surprising authority. How dare any of you presume to dictate the terms of my life? For 30 years, I have lived quietly, bothering no one, contributing to this community. Through my work and my healing, I have asked nothing from anyone, expected nothing, and received exactly that nothing. She stepped forward, and Mrs. Thornton actually took a step back. Now, when I have finally found companionship with good, honest men who treat me with respect and kindness, you arrive to tell me it's inappropriate? That I'm too old, too desperate, too pathetic to deserve the attention of worthy men. Reverend Doyle tried to interrupt, But Margaret was just getting started. Where were your concerns for my welfare during the blizzard of '85, when I nearly froze to death because no one bothered to check on the spinster at the edge of town? Where was your Christian charity when I was ill with fever 3 years ago, and lay in bed for a week with no one to bring so much as a cup of broth? Where were your moral standards when half this town was buying my remedies while treating me like I was invisible? Her voice rose with each question, 30 years of suppressed frustration pouring out like water from a broken dam. You ignored me when I was alone and miserable, and now you want to take away my happiness because it doesn't fit your narrow definition of appropriate behavior for women my age. Tom Whitfield stepped up beside her, his usual jovial manner replaced by fierce protectiveness. Miss Henley deserves every bit of respect and courtship any woman has ever received. She's earned it through her kindness, her intelligence, and her strength. We're not here to cause scandal, then Carter added, his quiet voice carrying more authority than Mrs. Thornton's bluster. We're here to offer a good woman the appreciation she should have received years ago. Mrs. Thornton drew herself up to her full height, clearly preparing for a final assault, but Jake Sullivan moved between her and Margaret with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to protecting what mattered to him. Ma'am, he said with deceptive mildness, I think you and your friends should leave now. Miss Henley has made her position clear, and we've made ours. Unless you have some legal authority to interfere with the private affairs of adults, I suggest you worry about your own business, and let us worry about ours. The delegation retreated, but not without Mrs. Thornton delivering a parting shot. This isn't over, Margaret. The decent people of this town won't stand for such behavior. Mark my words, you'll regret choosing these men over the respect of your community. As they drove away in their buggy, Margaret felt her anger drain away, leaving behind exhaustion and something that might have been fear. She had just made enemies of the 3 most powerful social authorities in Cedar Ridge, and she wasn't naive enough to think there wouldn't be consequences. Jake seemed to read her thoughts. Miss Henley, are you worried about what they might do? Margaret looked at the 6 men who had stood beside her without hesitation, who had defended her worth when her own community attacked it, and realized that she had something she'd never possessed before, allies who would fight for her happiness. Let them do their worst, she said with more confidence than she felt. I've lived without their approval for 30 years. I can certainly continue to do so now. But as evening fell and the Cowboys reluctantly returned to the Double T, Margaret stood alone on her porch and wondered if choosing love might cost her everything else. She'd worked so hard to build that Mrs. Thornton's threats materialized with the swift efficiency of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of social warfare. Within 3 days of the confrontation, Margaret discovered that her herb business, the foundation of her independence for over 15 years, was under systematic attack. It began subtly. Mrs. Patterson, who had relied on Margaret's arthritis remedies for 2 years, sent her grandson to return an unopened bottle with mumbled excuses about trying something different. The Hendricks family, whose baby had slept peacefully for months, thanks to Margaret's chamomile blend, suddenly found their usual order no longer necessary. Dr. Webb himself appeared at Margaret's door with a stern lecture about unlicensed medical practice and threats to contact territorial authorities if she continued playing doctor without proper credentials. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. Margaret was working in her greenhouse, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of plant care to calm her anxious thoughts. When she heard a single horse approaching, she looked up to see a stranger, a well-dressed man in a city suit, riding a horse that clearly wasn't his own. Miss Henley? The man called out as he dismounted awkwardly. I'm Harold Strickland, attorney from Denver. I represent several of your customers who have asked me to look into some concerns about your business practices. Margaret felt her stomach drop, but she kept her voice steady. What sort of concerns, Mr. Strickland? The lawyer removed a folder from his saddlebag with the ceremonial gravity of someone delivering a death sentence. Allegations of unlicensed medical practice, Miss Henley. Selling remedies without proper training or certification. Making medical claims without scientific backing. Potentially endangering public health through amateur herbalism. Margaret stared at the papers he thrust toward her, the legal language swimming before her eyes. These weren't just idle threats. This was a coordinated effort to destroy her livelihood entirely. I make no medical claims, she said carefully. I sell herbs and traditional preparations. People choose to buy them or not. Strickland's thin smile held no warmth. Nevertheless, Miss Henley, I'm authorized to inform you that unless you cease all commercial herb sales immediately, formal charges will be filed with the Territorial Medical Board. I'm sure you understand that such proceedings can be expensive, even for someone ultimately found innocent of wrongdoing. After he left, Margaret sat in her greenhouse surrounded by the plants that had been her companions, her purpose, her source of independence for decades, and faced the possibility that her entire world was crumbling. Without her herb business, she had no income. Without income, she couldn't maintain her property. Without her property, she had nothing to offer the 6 men courting her except herself, and she'd spent 30 years learning to believe that wasn't enough. It was in this state of quiet despair that Jake Sullivan found her an hour later. He took one look at her face and the legal papers scattered on her workbench, and his expression darkened into something dangerous. "Who did this?" he asked quietly. "It doesn't matter," Margaret replied, trying to inject some strength back into her voice. "What matters is that it's done. My business is finished. In a few weeks, maybe a few months, I'll lose everything." Jake picked up one of the legal documents, his jaw tightening as he read. "This is Adelaide Thornton's work. She's got connections in Denver, probably called in favors to arrange this." He set the paper down with controlled violence. "We can fight this, Margaret. Get you a lawyer, challenge these allegations. With what money?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "I'm a spinster herb woman, Jake. I don't have the resources to fight wealthy, connected people who want to destroy me. They've won." "No," Jake said fiercely, moving to stand directly in front of her. "They haven't won anything. You think we care about your herb business? You think any of us are courting you for your money or your property?" Margaret looked up at him, seeing the passion burning in his dark eyes, and felt something break open in her chest. "Then what are you courting me for?" "I'm 48 years old, Jake. I'm past childbearing, I'm set in my ways, and now I'm about to lose everything that made me useful or independent. What could you possibly want with me?" Jake stared at her for a long moment, then did something that changed everything between them. He reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "I want you, Margaret Henley," he said with quiet intensity. "Not your business, not your property, not what you can do for me. I want the woman who can coax life from dead soil, who stands up to bullies 3 times her size, who treats a broken-down cowboy like he's worth something. I want the woman who laughs at Tom's terrible jokes and listens to Danny's engineering theories like they matter. I want the woman who makes me feel like I could be the man I always hoped to be." Margaret felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling under the weight of his honesty. "Jake ... I love you," he said simply. "Not because you're convenient or available or the only option. I love you because in 3 weeks you've shown me what it means to have a real partner, someone who makes everything better just by being there." The words hung between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to build. Margaret stared into Jake's eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there, the terror of vulnerability, the desperate hope, the overwhelming relief of finally being truly seen by someone who mattered. "I love you too," she whispered and felt the admission both liberate and terrify her. Jake's smile was like sunrise, transforming his entire face. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he kissed her with the reverence of a man who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. Margaret had been kissed before, but never like this, never with such tenderness mixed with passion, never with the feeling that she was precious rather than convenient, never with the certainty that the man holding her saw her as a gift rather than a compromise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Margaret realized that her world had shifted on its axis. Everything she'd thought she understood about her situation, about her feelings, about her future, had been rewritten in the space of a single kiss. But what about the others? She asked, the practical part of her mind asserting itself even as her heart raced. Ben and Luke and Tom and Sam and Danny. They've been nothing but kind to me. They've worked so hard, been so patient. Jake's expression grew complicated. I know. And that's what makes this so difficult. They're not just my competitors, Margaret. They're my friends. We've worked together, lived together, trusted each other with our lives. If you choose me, I'll be gaining everything I want while they lose everything they hoped for. Margaret felt the weight of 6 hearts pressing against her own. These weren't faceless suitors competing for an abstract prize. They were men she'd come to care about deeply. Each one worthy of love, each one deserving of happiness. How can I choose? She asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her for weeks. How can I break 5 hearts to heal one? How can I destroy 5 dreams to fulfill one? Jake took her hands in his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Because the heart doesn't work democratically, Margaret. Love isn't fair or logical or considerate of everyone's feelings. It just is. And fighting, it doesn't make it go away, it just makes everyone more miserable. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of the other 5 men. Margaret felt panic flutter in her chest as she realized they would see immediately that something had changed between her and Jake. The intimacy was written in their proximity, in the way Jake's hands still rested protectively on her back, in the lingering evidence of tears and kisses on her face. Ben Carter dismounted first, his gentle eyes taking in the scene with the quick intelligence of a man accustomed to reading situations. His face went very still as understanding dawned. I see, he said quietly, and Margaret heard years of accumulated disappointment in those 2 words. Luke Morrison's reaction was more analytical, his gaze moving from Margaret's tear-stained face to the legal papers, scattered on her workbench, to Jake's protective posture. Someone's been causing trouble, he observed with forced casualness. Tom Whitfield's usual cheerfulness faltered as he looked between Margaret and Jake, his expressive face revealing the exact moment he understood what he was seeing. Well, he said with a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes, I guess congratulations are in order. Sam Rodriguez said nothing, but Margaret saw him close his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a physical blow. Danny O'Brien looked confused and hurt, like a child who couldn't understand why his favorite toy had been given to someone else. It's not ... we haven't. Margaret began, then stopped, realizing that denying what had happened would be both futile and cruel. I'm sorry, she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't apologize, Ben said with characteristic gentleness, though Margaret could see the effort it cost him. Love isn't something you apologize for, Miss Henley. It's something you celebrate, even when it breaks your heart. Luke stepped forward, his intellectual nature helping him process the emotional complexity more quickly than the others. Jake's a good man, Margaret. If your heart chose him, you chose well. That's not the only problem, Jake said, gesturing toward the legal papers. Adelaide Thornton's escalated her war. She's trying to destroy Margaret's business entirely. The shift from personal heartbreak to external threat was immediate and dramatic. Whatever romantic disappointment the 5 men felt was instantly subordinated to their protective instincts toward Margaret and their loyalty to each other. What can we do? Danny asked, his hurt forgotten in the face of a problem that required solving. "We fight," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying the steel of a man who had faced prejudice and persecution before. "Together," Tom nodded grimly. "They want to hurt our Margaret. They'll have to go through all 6 of us first." Margaret felt her heart swell with something larger than romantic love, the overwhelming gratitude of discovering that she had found not just a husband, but a family. 5 men who could have turned away in hurt and jealousy instead chose to stand with her in her darkest hour. "Why?" she asked, looking at each of their faces in turn. "Why would you help me after?" "Because this isn't about winning or losing anymore," Luke said simply. "This is about protecting someone we all care about from people who want to destroy her for the crime of being happy." As the 6 men, her beloved Jake and his 5 loyal friends, began planning their strategy to save her business and her future, Margaret realized that she had stumbled into something rarer than romantic love. She had found a chosen family, bound together not by blood or law, but by mutual respect, shared values, and the determination to protect each other against a world that could be cruel to those who dared to be different. The battle for her heart had been won. Now the battle for her future was about to begin. The war room was Margaret's kitchen table, but the 6 men gathered around it approached their strategy session with the serious intensity of generals planning a major campaign. Maps, legal documents, and hastily scrawled notes covered the scarred wooden surface, while coffee grew cold in forgotten cups as they debated tactics late into the evening. "The key is documentation," Luke Morrison said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he studied a thick folder he'd produced from somewhere. "Margaret, you've been keeping records of your customers, your preparations, your results?" Margaret nodded, fetching a leather-bound ledger from her desk. "Every sale, every ingredient, every customer complaint or compliment for the past 12 years. My aunt taught me that proper records were the foundation of any legitimate business." Danny O'Brien leaned forward eagerly, his engineer's mind already working on the problem. "What about testimonials? Letters from satisfied customers?" "Doctor, referrals?" "I have some," Margaret said, opening a small wooden box filled with folded papers. "People don't usually write formal letters, but I've kept the ones I received." Jake examined one of the letters, a note from a grateful mother whose child had recovered from a persistent cough after using Margaret's herbal syrup. "This is from Mrs. Coleman in Durango. Her husband's the territorial judge's brother-in-law." "Connections," Ben said thoughtfully. "That's what we need, people with influence who can vouch for Margaret's character and the legitimacy of her work." Sam Rodriguez, who had been quietly studying the legal papers, looked up with a grim expression. "The problem isn't just the medical practice accusations. Look at this clause here. They're claiming she's running an unlicensed business without proper permits, avoiding taxes, operating outside municipal regulations." Tom Whitfield, despite his own heartbreak, managed a rueful chuckle. "They're really pulling out all the stops, aren't they?" Makes a man almost admire the thoroughness of their vindictiveness. "It's not admirable," Jake said darkly. "It's systematic persecution designed to destroy someone whose only crime was finding happiness they didn't approve of." Margaret stared at the stack of legal challenges mounting against her and felt overwhelmed by the complexity of fighting people with resources, connections, and the backing of social authority. "Maybe I should just give up," she said quietly. "Sell the property, leave Cedar Ridge, start somewhere fresh where nobody knows my history." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Jake's fist hit the table with enough force to make the coffee cups jump. "Absolutely not," he said with fierce intensity. "We don't run from bullies, Margaret. We stand and fight, and we make them regret they ever decided to mess with people we care about." "Jake's right," Danny said, his youthful face set with determination. "You've done nothing wrong, Miss Margaret. Everything you've built here, you've earned honestly. We're not going to let them steal it from you." Luke was studying the legal documents with the focused attention he usually reserved for agricultural journals. There's something odd about the timing of this complaint, he mused. Look at the dates. The formal accusations were filed before the supposed investigation was completed. That suggests this was predetermined rather than responsive to actual evidence. What does that mean? Margaret asked. It means they rushed their paperwork, Sam said, understanding immediately. Made mistakes, left gaps we can exploit. Ben leaned back in his chair, his gentle face thoughtful. We're approaching this wrong, he said slowly. We're trying to fight them on their terms, in their system, with their rules. But what if we change the game entirely? What do you mean? Jake asked. Ben smiled, and for the first time since discovering Margaret's choice, his expression held genuine warmth. What if instead of defending Margaret's business, we expand it? Make it so legitimate, so official, so publicly beneficial that attacking it would be political suicide. The idea hung in the air like a spark waiting to catch fire. Margaret felt something stir in her chest, not hope exactly, but the first glimmer of possibility. I'm listening, she said, then pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching rapidly. The territorial government has been looking for ways to attract Eastern investment, right? They want to show that Colorado Territory is civilized, modern, forward-thinking. What if we gave them a model enterprise they could point to with pride? A legitimate medicinal herb company, Luke caught on immediately. Properly licensed, scientifically documented, professionally operated. With customers throughout the territory, Danny added, his engineering mind already working on logistics. Distribution networks, quality controls, standardized preparations. And, Tom said with growing excitement, testimonials from doctors, judges, territorial officials, people they can't dismiss as ignorant yokels. Jake looked at Margaret, his dark eyes intense. What do you think? Instead of hiding from the fight, we make ourselves too valuable to attack. Margaret stared at the rough sketch Ben was creating, seeing her small herb garden transformed into something grand and official and undeniably legitimate. The scale of it was both thrilling and terrifying. It would require capital, she said practically. Equipment, proper facilities, legal documentation, business licenses. I don't have that kind of money. We do, Jake said simply. The double. T-Ranch is worth enough to finance something like this. If we're going to be married anyway, our resources become shared resources. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks at the casual way he mentioned marriage, as if it were an established fact rather than a hoped-for possibility. But before she could respond, Sam was already building on the idea. We could turn part of the ranch into cultivation fields, he said. I know something about large-scale farming. With proper irrigation and soil management, we could grow everything you need instead of relying on wild harvesting. And I could design processing facilities. Danny added eagerly. Steam-powered preparation equipment, standardized bottling systems, quality control mechanisms. Marketing and distribution, Tom chimed in. I know people in Denver, Santa Fe, even some contacts in San Francisco. We could build a customer base that stretches across the entire West. Luke was nodding thoughtfully. The scientific documentation would be crucial. We'd need to work with legitimate doctors, maybe even contact some of the medical colleges back east, turn folk remedies into standardized medicines with proven efficacy. Margaret looked around the table at these 6 men who were casually discussing investing their entire future in her small herb business, turning her modest enterprise into something that could revolutionize territorial commerce, and felt overwhelmed by their faith in her abilities. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you risk everything for this? Ben answered first. Because you're worth it, Miss Margaret. Your knowledge, your skills, your dedication, they deserve to be celebrated, not hidden or attacked. Because bullies need to learn that decent people won't be intimidated, Jake added grimly. Because it's a genuinely good business opportunity, Luke said with characteristic practicality. The demand for reliable medicines is enormous, and you're the most skilled herbalist in 3 territories. Because it would be fun, Tom said, with a grin that was only slightly forced. Taking on the establishment and winning, making them eat their words? That's the kind of adventure I've been waiting for my whole life. Because someone needs to prove that Mexican cowboys and Irish, dreamers and broken-hearted gentlemen can build something magnificent when they work together, Sam said quietly. Because I want to build something that matters, Danny said with youthful intensity. Something that helps people and proves that innovation and tradition can work together. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she realized these men weren't just offering to help her fight. They were offering to build a future together. All of them, despite the romantic complications that could have torn them apart. There's still the matter of the immediate legal challenges, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. We can't build this empire if I'm facing criminal charges. That's why we start tonight, Jake said decisively. We document everything. Gather testimonials, compile evidence, and present the territorial authorities with a comprehensive business proposal before our enemies can get their accusations officially filed. A preemptive strike, Luke agreed. Instead of defending against charges, we present them with an opportunity too valuable to ignore. Ben was already making lists. We'll need letters of support from customers, documentation of your training and experience, financial projections, territorial permits and licenses. And we'll need to move fast, Sam added, before Mrs. Thornton realizes what we're doing and tries to interfere. Margaret looked at the plan taking shape before her. Ambitious, risky, requiring trust and cooperation and resources that would bind their futures together regardless of romantic entanglements, and realized that these 6 men were offering her something she'd never dared dream of, not just love, not just security, but genuine partnership in building something important and lasting. They were asking her to be not just a wife, but a business partner, an innovator, a leader in transforming how the entire territory thought about medicine and commerce. All right, she said, and heard her own voice growing stronger with each word. Let's do it. Let's build something so remarkable that they'll regret they ever tried to tear me down. The cheer that went up around her kitchen table was loud enough to wake every chicken in her coop, but Margaret didn't care. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't facing the future alone. She had allies, partners, friends who were willing to risk everything to help her succeed. And if Adelaide Thornton thought she could destroy Margaret Henley with legal papers and social pressure, she was about to discover that she'd picked a fight with the wrong woman. The battle for Margaret's future was about to become a war for the soul of Cedar Ridge itself, and Margaret's side was loaded for bear. The Denver territorial offices had never seen anything quite like the delegation that arrived on the early morning train 3 days later. Margaret Henley, dressed in her finest dark blue traveling dress with her silver-streaked hair arranged in an elegant chignon, walked through the marble-floored corridors flanked by 6 cowboys who had traded their usual work clothes for their best Sunday suits. They moved with the confident purpose of people who had come not to beg, but to negotiate. Jake Sullivan carried a leather portfolio containing their carefully prepared business proposal. Luke Morrison had a second case filled with scientific documentation and customer testimonials. Danny O'Brien clutched architectural drawings and engineering specifications. The other 3 men served as both moral support and living proof that their enterprise had the backing of serious, capable individuals. Margaret had barely slept during the train journey, her mind churning through everything that could go wrong. This was their one chance to get ahead of Mrs. Thornton's legal assault, to transform the narrative from scandal to opportunity. If they failed here, she would return to Cedar Ridge facing not just social ostracism but potential criminal charges. Remember, Jake had told her as they approached the territorial building, we're not here as supplicants. We're here as citizens proposing a legitimate business venture that would benefit the entire territory. Hold your head high." The territorial secretary, a thin man named Carruthers with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes, initially seemed inclined to dismiss them with the bureaucratic indifference reserved for hopeful petitioners. But when Luke Morrison began explaining the scope of their proposed medicinal enterprise and Danny O'Brien unrolled his detailed facility designs, Carruthers' attention sharpened considerably. "You're proposing to establish a commercial pharmaceutical operation?" Carruthers asked, studying Danny's blueprints with growing interest. "Here in Colorado Territory?" "Not just commercial," Margaret said, finding her voice and her confidence. "Educational and research-oriented as well. We envision partnerships with Eastern medical colleges, documentation of indigenous plant remedies, standardization of preparations that could serve as models for similar enterprises throughout the West." Carruthers set down the blueprints and looked at Margaret with new respect. "Miss Henley, are you aware that the territorial government has been seeking exactly this type of legitimate medical enterprise to showcase our commitment to modern development?" Margaret felt her heart skip. "No, sir, I wasn't aware of that. The governor has been under pressure from Eastern investors who question whether Colorado Territory can support sophisticated commercial ventures," Carruthers explained. "A scientifically operated pharmaceutical company run by local residents with documented expertise would address many of those concerns." Ben Carter stepped forward with his characteristic gentle manner. "Sir, we've prepared financial projections showing potential tax revenue, employment opportunities, and economic impact for the region." He handed over a thick folder. "We believe this enterprise could serve as a model for territorial development." Carruthers examined the financial documents with obvious interest. These projections assume significant initial investment. "Do you have the necessary capital?" "The Double T Ranch is prepared to serve as collateral for the initial development," Jake said formally. "Additionally, we have commitments from several Denver merchants for equipment and supplies." What Jake didn't mention was that those commitments had been secured through Tom Whitfield's charm and creative interpretation of their financial position during a whirlwind tour of Denver businesses the previous day. Tom had convinced 3 equipment suppliers to extend credit based on their projected territorial contracts that didn't yet exist, but that Tom assured them were practically guaranteed. "I'll need to discuss this with Governor Patterson," Carruthers said, but his tone suggested genuine interest rather than polite dismissal. "Can you remain in Denver for 2 days while we review your proposal?" "Certainly," Margaret said, though she knew their limited funds hadn't anticipated an extended stay in the territorial capital. As they left the territorial offices, Margaret felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. They had cleared the first hurdle, but the real test lay ahead. If Governor Patterson rejected their proposal, they would return to Cedar Ridge worse off than before, deeper in debt, and facing the same legal challenges that had driven them to this desperate gambit. That evening, in the cramped rooms they'd rented above a boarding house restaurant, the 7 conspirators gathered to assess their situation. They had spent nearly all their ready cash on train fare, lodging, and the various fees required to submit their formal proposal. If they didn't receive approval soon, they wouldn't even be able to afford return tickets to Cedar Ridge. "No regrets," Tom said firmly, as if reading everyone's thoughts. "We took our shot. Whatever happens now, we can't say we didn't try." But it was Sam Rodriguez who identified their most immediate problem. "Even if they approve our proposal, we still have to get home and deal with Mrs. Thornton's legal assault. She's not going to wait patiently while we negotiate with territorial authorities." Luke had been reading a Denver newspaper, but he looked up sharply at Sam's words. "Actually, she might have to. Look at this." He held up the paper, pointing to a small article on the 3rd page. "Territorial Pharmaceutical Initiative under consideration," Margaret read aloud. Governor Patterson is reviewing proposals for legitimate medical enterprises that could serve as models for territorial development. Jake leaned closer to examine the article. How did the newspaper find out about our meeting? Luke's smile was satisfied. I may have mentioned to a reporter friend that Colorado Territory was about to make a significant announcement regarding modern medical commerce. Sometimes information spreads exactly when you want it to. Margaret stared at the newspaper article, realizing the implications. This makes it public knowledge that we're working with territorial authorities on a legitimate business venture. Mrs. Thornton can't very well attack us for unlicensed medical practice. While the governor is publicly considering licensing our medical practice. Brilliant, Danny breathed. You've made it politically dangerous for them to continue their persecution. But their celebration was interrupted by a knock at the door. Margaret's heart sank, expecting some new crisis or complication. Instead, they found themselves facing a well-dressed elderly gentleman with kind eyes and a distinguished bearing. Miss Henley? The man asked. I'm Dr. Charles Whitman from the Denver Medical College. I understand you're proposing to establish a pharmaceutical research facility. Margaret exchanged glances with Jake, unsure whether this was opportunity or disaster. Yes, sir. May I ask how you heard about our proposal? Dr. Whitman smiled. The territorial medical community is quite small, my dear. Word travels quickly when someone proposes something genuinely innovative. He paused, studying her with obvious interest. I've been looking for someone with practical herbalism knowledge to collaborate on a research project, documenting indigenous plant remedies. Your timing is remarkably fortuitous. What followed was the most intellectually stimulating conversation Margaret had experienced in years. Dr. Whitman's questions were probing but respectful, focused on her methods, her results, her understanding of plant chemistry and therapeutic applications. Unlike the hostile interrogation she'd expected from medical authorities, this felt like a genuine exchange between colleagues. Your approach to preparing willow bark extract, Dr. Whitman said after Margaret described her arthritis remedy, anticipates some recent European research into salicin compounds. Have you considered standardizing the concentration? I've experimented with different preparations, Margaret replied, but I've never had access to the equipment needed for precise chemical analysis. Dr. Whitman's eyes lit up. That's exactly what I'm hoping to address. The medical college has been granted funds to establish a research laboratory for botanical medicine. We need someone with your practical expertise to guide the scientific investigation. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly as she realized what he was offering. You're suggesting a formal partnership between your medical college and our proposed enterprise? I'm suggesting that your enterprise might serve as the practical application arm of our research laboratory. Dr. Whitman corrected. Academic research combined with commercial development, scientific rigor paired with traditional knowledge. It would be groundbreaking. Jake stepped forward, his business instincts recognizing opportunity. What would such a partnership involve, practically speaking? Funding, Dr. Whitman said simply. Equipment, facilities, scientific validation, medical school endorsement, and access to Eastern pharmaceutical markets. He paused, letting the implications sink in. In exchange, we would want exclusive documentation rights to your methods, and the right to publish our collaborative research. Margaret looked around at her 6 partners, seeing her own amazement reflected in their faces. What had begun as a desperate attempt to escape persecution was transforming into an opportunity that exceeded their wildest ambitions. We would need to maintain control of our commercial operations, she said carefully. This partnership would enhance our enterprise, not replace it. Absolutely, Dr. Whitman agreed. We're not interested in taking over your business, Miss Henley. We're interested in learning from it while helping it achieve scientific legitimacy and commercial success. That night, as they prepared for bed in their cramped boarding house rooms, Margaret realized that everything had changed again. They were no longer desperate fugitives seeking to escape persecution. They were potential pioneers in a new field that could transform both medicine and commerce throughout the American West. "Are you ready for this?" Jake asked quietly as they stood together on the narrow balcony overlooking Denver's gaslit streets. "This is bigger than just saving your herb business. This is about building something that could outlast all of us." Margaret looked out at the sprawling city below, thinking of the small herb garden where this entire adventure had begun. "6 months ago, I was invisible," she said softly. "A forgotten spinster that nobody noticed or cared about. Now I'm about to become a pioneer in territorial pharmaceutical development." Jake's arm slipped around her waist, solid and reassuring. "You were never invisible, Margaret. You were just waiting for the right people to see you." Tomorrow would bring Governor Patterson's decision and the next phase of their improbable journey. But tonight, standing above Denver with the man she loved and 5 loyal friends sleeping nearby, Margaret Henley felt something she'd never experienced before: the absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. The forgotten spinster had become the center of something magnificent, and there was no telling how far their shared adventure might take them. The train journey back to Cedar Ridge should have been triumphant. Governor Patterson had not only approved their pharmaceutical enterprise, but had personally endorsed it as a model for territorial development. Dr. Whitman's partnership agreement was signed and sealed in Jake's portfolio, along with a territorial business license that made Margaret's medicinal preparations not just legal, but officially sanctioned by the highest authorities in Colorado Territory. Yet as the train carried them through the familiar mountain passes toward home, Margaret felt a growing sense of unease. They had won the war, but the battle awaiting them in Cedar Ridge might prove more dangerous than anything they'd faced in Denver. "You're worried about Adelaide Thornton," Luke observed, settling into the seat beside her as the others dozed in the late afternoon sunshine streaming through the train windows. "She's invested too much in destroying me to simply give up because—" "We've gained official recognition," Margaret replied quietly. "People like Adelaide don't admit defeat gracefully. They escalate." Luke nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing. We've made her look foolish in front of the entire territory. That newspaper article about the governor's endorsement will have reached Cedar Ridge by now. She knows we've outmaneuvered her politically, which means she'd try something more direct," Jake said from across the aisle, proving he hadn't been sleeping after all. "Adelaide Thornton strikes me as the type of woman who would burn down the barn rather than admit she can't control the livestock." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You think she might actually try to damage the property?" "I think we need to be prepared for anything," Jake replied seriously. "A woman who would coordinate a legal attack to destroy someone's livelihood is capable of considerable malice when backed into a corner." Ben Carter, who had been quietly reading a Denver newspaper, looked up with concern. "There's something else we need to consider. This article mentions the financial backing from the Double T Ranch and our plans for large-scale cultivation. If anyone wanted to stop our enterprise, attacking the ranch itself would be the most effective approach." Sam Rodriguez straightened in his seat, his expression darkening. "The ranch has been empty for 3 days while we've been in Denver. No one watching the property, no one maintaining security." Danny O'Brien, ever practical, was already calculating. If someone wanted to cause serious damage, they'd have had plenty of opportunity. Livestock could be scattered, buildings burned, equipment destroyed. The mood in their train car shifted from tired satisfaction to urgent concern as the implications sank in. They weren't just returning home to celebrate their success. They might be returning to discover that their enemies had struck at the foundation of everything they'd built. "How much longer until we reach Cedar Ridge?" Tom asked, his usual cheerfulness replaced by grim determination. 2 hours, Jake replied, consulting his pocket watch. "Too long if there's real trouble brewing." Margaret stared out the window at the landscape rolling past and realized that her period of being a passive victim was truly over. Whether or not Adelaide Thornton had escalated to property damage, Margaret could no longer simply react to other people's attacks. She had resources now, allies, official recognition, and legitimate power. It was time to use them. "When we get back," she said quietly, "we're not going to sneak around or try to avoid confrontation. We're going to announce our success publicly, make it clear that anyone who attacks us is attacking a territorial enterprise, and force our enemies to either back down or reveal themselves completely." Jake smiled, the expression transforming his tired face. "I was hoping you'd say something like that." The train whistle announced their approach to Cedar Ridge, just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise either glory or bloodshed. As they disembarked, Margaret noticed several townspeople watching from the platform with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Mrs. Patterson hurried forward, her face creased with worry. "Miss Margaret, thank goodness you're back safe. There's been developments while you were away." Margaret's heart sank. "What kind of developments?" "Your property's been watched," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, glancing around to ensure she wasn't overheard. "Groups of men riding past at all hours, some of them stopping to examine your fences and buildings. Adelaide Thornton's been telling everyone you fled to avoid criminal prosecution." "And the ranch?" Jake asked urgently. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew even more troubled. "There was a fire 2 nights ago. The old barn on the north section burned completely. Sheriff says it was probably lightning, but there hasn't been a storm in a week." The 6 men exchanged dark looks. Arson was a serious escalation, one that suggested their enemies were no longer content with legal persecution or social pressure. "Anyone hurt?" Sam asked. "No, thank the Lord. But Jake, there's more. Someone's been spreading stories that you men abandoned the ranch to flee territorial authorities, that the whole Double T is going to be seized for unpaid taxes and illegal operations." Margaret felt anger kindle in her chest like a forge fire. While they'd been in Denver legitimately building their future, Adelaide Thornton and her allies had been systematically destroying their reputation and potentially their property. "We need to get to the ranch immediately," Jake said, but Margaret caught his arm. "No," she said firmly. "First, we make our announcement. We do this publicly, officially, with witnesses." Tom grinned, despite the circumstances. "Planning to make a scene, Miss Margaret?" "I'm planning to end this war once and for all," Margaret replied. "Mrs. Patterson, is there still a town meeting scheduled for tonight?" Mrs. Patterson nodded. "Monthly community gathering at the church. Adelaide's been promising to address the moral crisis created by your situation." "Perfect," Margaret said, straightening her shoulders. "Gentlemen, we're about to give Cedar Ridge the most interesting town meeting in its history." An hour later, Margaret walked into the Cedar Ridge Community Church, with her head held high and her 6 partners flanking her like an honor guard. The murmur of conversation died instantly as every head turned to stare at the group that had supposedly fled the territory in disgrace. Adelaide Thornton, positioned at the front of the church like a prosecutor preparing to address a jury, went pale when she saw them. Reverend Doyle, who had been arranging papers at the podium, nearly dropped his Bible. Dr. Webb's mouth actually fell open in shock. "Good evening, neighbors," Margaret said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed church. "I understand there's been some concern about our recent activities, so we thought we should address those concerns directly." Jake stepped forward and placed a leather portfolio on the communion table with ceremonial significance. "These are the official territorial documents licensing the Henley Sullivan Pharmaceutical enterprise as a legitimate medical research and production facility, personally endorsed by Governor Patterson himself." The silence was so complete that Margaret could hear the church clock ticking on the wall behind the altar. Luke Morrison opened a second folder. This is the partnership agreement between our enterprise and the Denver Medical College, establishing the first collaborative pharmaceutical research laboratory in Colorado Territory. Ben Carter added a third set of documents. These are the financial agreements and territorial development grants that will bring an estimated $50,000 in Eastern investment to Cedar Ridge over the next 2 years. The numbers hit the congregation like physical blows. $50,000 was more money than most of them had ever imagined seeing in their lifetimes, and it was coming to their small mountain town because of the woman they'd been prepared to ostracize. Adelaide Thornton finally found her voice. This is preposterous. These people are criminals, facing legal charges for unlicensed medical practice and business fraud. Margaret smiled, the expression containing no warmth whatsoever. Mrs. Thornton, are you suggesting that Governor Patterson, the Territorial Medical Board, and the Denver Medical College have all been deceived by criminals? That's a very serious accusation to make against territorial authorities. Adelaide's face flushed red as she realized the trap she'd walked into. Attacking Margaret now meant attacking the territorial government itself. Furthermore, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, I understand there have been some unfortunate incidents at the Double T Ranch during our absence. Property damage, possible arson, attempts to sabotage a territorial development project. Sheriff Dunley, who had been sitting quietly in the back row, suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Jake's voice carried the steel of barely controlled anger. Attacking a territorial enterprise is a federal crime, folks. The kind of crime that brings federal marshals to investigate, the kind that puts people in territorial prison for long sentences. Dr. Webb attempted to interrupt. Now see here, you can't just waltz in here with a handful of papers and expect us to doctor. Luke Morrison said quietly, are you questioning the legitimacy of territorial government documents? Because I have a reporter from the Denver Post waiting outside who would be very interested in your opinion of Governor Patterson's business judgment. The threat was clear and effective. Dr. Webb subsided into sullen silence. Margaret looked around the church at the faces of people who had ignored her for 30 years, then tried to destroy her for daring to find happiness, and felt no desire for revenge, only profound disappointment. I want to be very clear about something, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. We didn't return to Cedar Ridge to gloat or to punish anyone. We returned because this is our home, and because our enterprise will bring jobs, investment, and recognition to this community. She paused, letting her gaze rest briefly on each of the authority figures who had tried to break her. But make no mistake, we will not tolerate further harassment, property damage, or attempts to sabotage a territorial development project. The next person who attacks our enterprise will find themselves dealing with federal authorities, not local politics. As Margaret and her 6 partners filed out of the church, leaving behind a congregation too stunned to respond, she realized that the forgotten spinster of Cedar Ridge had become something far more formidable, a woman with power, allies, and the absolute determination to protect what she'd built. The war was over. But as they rode toward the Double T Ranch to assess the damage and begin rebuilding, Margaret knew that winning the war was only the beginning of the real work ahead. Now they had to prove that 6 cowboys and 1 determined woman could turn their impossible dreams into a reality that would transform not just their own lives, but the future of the entire territory. 1 year later, Margaret Sullivan stood in the observation tower of the Henley Sullivan Pharmaceutical Research Facility, watching the sun rise over what had once been empty rangeland and was now the most advanced medical manufacturing operation west of the Mississippi River. The transformation was so complete that visitors from Denver often had trouble believing they were still in the same remote mountain valley that had once been known only for cattle ranching and forgotten dreams. Below her, Steam-powered processing equipment hummed in buildings designed by Danny O'Brien's. Innovative engineering. Carefully tended cultivation fields stretched across acres that Sam Rodriguez had transformed from rough pasture into precisely managed growing plots. Tom Whitfield's distribution network now carried their standardized remedies to customers from San Francisco to St. Louis, while Luke Morrison's scientific documentation had earned recognition from medical colleges across the eastern states. Ben Carter emerged from the main laboratory building, carrying the morning's production reports and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had found his true calling as operations manager of an enterprise that fed both body and soul. The Denver Medical College delegation arrives at 10. He informed Margaret, setting the reports on her desk with characteristic care. Dr. Whitman is bringing 3 professors and 2 potential investors from Boston. They want to see everything: this cultivation methods, the processing facilities, the quality control systems, the research documentation. Margaret nodded, but her attention was drawn to movement in the main courtyard, where Jake was working with a crew of local men to install the bronze plaque that would officially dedicate the facility. Watching her husband, still a source of quiet amazement after 6 months of marriage, coordinate the installation with his usual blend of authority and consideration, Margaret reflected on how completely their lives had changed. The wedding had been the social event of the decade in Cedar Ridge, attended by territorial officials, medical college professors, Denver businessmen, and half the population of 3 counties. Even Adelaide Thornton had attended, though whether from genuine conciliation or social necessity remained unclear. Margaret had worn her grandmother's pearl necklace and a dress of ivory silk that transformed her from competent businesswoman into radiant bride, while Jake had looked handsome enough in his new black suit to make every unmarried woman in the territory sigh with envy. But more meaningful than the grand ceremony had been the quiet moment afterward, when Ben, Luke, Tom, Sam, and Danny had each approached Margaret privately to offer their blessings and their continued friendship. They had kept their word about supporting whichever man she chose, and in the months since, their bond as chosen family had only grown stronger. Margaret? Ben's voice brought her back to the present. There's something else. A telegram arrived this morning from Washington. Margaret accepted the yellow paper with curiosity that quickly transformed into amazement as she read the official message from the Department of the Interior. They want us to establish a second facility, she said, looking up at Ben with wonder. In Arizona Territory, to research desert plant medicines and provide pharmaceutical services for the mining communities. Ben's gentle smile broadened into something approaching jubilation. The Arizona Territorial Governor specifically requested our enterprise, said he'd heard about our success and wanted to replicate it for his territory. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A familiar group of 6 riders was approaching the facility, but these weren't the desperate cowboys who had appeared at her gate seeking salvation a year ago. These were successful businessmen, partners in a thriving enterprise, men who had found not just economic security, but genuine purpose in building something meaningful together. Jake dismounted and looked up at the observation tower, catching Margaret's eye through the window. Even at this distance, she could see the smile that had become as essential to her happiness as breathing. He gestured toward the bronze plaque, now properly installed, and she could read the inscription that had been their collective decision. Henry Sullivan Pharmaceutical Research Facility, established 1888, where forgotten dreams become eternal legacies, dedicated to the proposition that the most valuable resources are the human hearts, brave enough to build something together. An hour later, Margaret stood before the assembled crowd gathered for the official dedication ceremony. The audience included territorial officials, medical college professors, local townspeople, business investors, and reporters from newspapers across the West. But her attention focused on 6 men standing in the front row, the partners and friends who had transformed her life from solitary survival into shared abundance. "A year ago," Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "I was a forgotten woman living at the edge of a small town, convinced that my opportunity for significance had passed me by decades earlier. I believed that. At 48, my chance for love, for partnership, for building something meaningful with my life, had been permanently lost." She paused, looking directly at Jake, whose dark eyes held all the warmth and admiration she'd never dared hope to see directed toward her. "I was wrong about almost everything. I was wrong about it being too late for new beginnings. I was wrong about love being reserved for the young. I was wrong about having to choose between independence and partnership. And most importantly, I was wrong about the nature of true wealth." Margaret gestured toward the facility behind her. "It's modern. Buildings and innovative equipment representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment and development. This enterprise has brought economic prosperity to our region, scientific advancement to our territory, and medical relief to countless people across the American West. But that's not its most valuable contribution." She looked at each of her. 5 partners in turn: Ben with his gentle strength, Luke with his intellectual integrity, Tom with his irrepressible optimism, Sam with his quiet dignity, Danny with his innovative vision. Its most valuable contribution is proof that the human heart has no expiration date for hope, that dreams deferred are not dreams denied, and that the most profound success comes not from what we achieve alone, but from what we build together, with people who see our worth when we've forgotten it ourselves. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she approached the heart of what she wanted to say. 6 cowboys came to my door because they needed a wife to inherit a ranch. But what they gave me was something infinitely more precious. They gave me back my own value, my own possibility, my own right to dream of futures I'd stopped believing I deserved." Jake stepped forward, and Margaret saw him not as he was now successful businessman, respected community leader, beloved husband, but as he'd been that first morning, hat in hand and hope in his eyes, offering her a chance at the life she'd thought was permanently beyond her reach. "In return, I gave them not just a business partner or a wife, but a sister, a friend, a collaborator in building something that none of us could have imagined alone. Together, we discovered that the most forgotten people often possess the most valuable gifts, waiting for the right partners to help them flourish." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Margaret barely heard it. She was watching 5 men who had competed for her hand and lost, now cheering her success with genuine joy and pride. She was seeing a community that had dismissed her for 30 years now celebrating her achievements as their own. She was experiencing the profound satisfaction of knowing that her life had become not just personally fulfilling, but genuinely useful to the wider world. Later, as the celebration continued with tours of the facility and demonstrations of their innovative processes, Margaret found herself alone in her office with the Arizona Telegram still lying on her desk. The opportunity it represented was enormous, a chance to expand their success, to help develop another territory, to bring their model of collaborative enterprise to new frontiers. Jake appeared in her doorway, loosening his tie after a day of formal presentations and ceremonial speeches. "So," he said with the easy intimacy of a man completely comfortable in his marriage, "what do you think about Arizona?" Margaret looked at her husband, seeing in his face the same adventurous spirit that had brought 6 cowboys to her door seeking salvation and finding instead the foundation for building dreams neither they nor she had dared imagine. "I think," she said slowly, "that we've proven something important here. We've proven that it's never too late for forgotten people to become unforgettable, that deferred dreams can become even more magnificent than original hopes, and that the right partnerships can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities." Jake moved to stand beside her desk, his hand settling on her shoulder with the casual affection that had become the background music of her daily happiness. We've also proven that 6 cowboys and 1 determined woman can accomplish things that seem impossible when you're willing to work together and refuse to give up on each other. Margaret stood and moved to the window where she could see her 5 partners and friends still engaged with visitors, still demonstrating the innovations they'd developed together, still embodying the collaborative spirit that had made all of this possible. Arizona Territory has its own forgotten people, she said thoughtfully. Its own dreamers who've been told they're too old, too unconventional, too set in their ways to build something new. Jake's smile was answer enough. 3 months later, a wagon train left Cedar Ridge carrying equipment, supplies, and personnel for the second Henley Sullivan Pharmaceutical Research Facility. Margaret rode beside Jake in the lead wagon, while Ben, Luke, Tom, Sam, and Danny followed with their own families' wives they'd found after learning what true partnership looked like. Children who would grow up in a world where collaborative dreams routinely became magnificent realities. As they crested the final ridge and looked back at the facility they'd built together, Margaret marveled at the view. What had once been empty rangeland now bustled with activity, prosperity, and purpose. The forgotten Spinster's herb garden had become the seed of an enterprise that would eventually stretch across multiple territories, provide employment for hundreds of families, and advance medical science throughout the American West. But more than the buildings and the business success, more than the recognition and the wealth, what Margaret treasured most was the knowledge that she had been wrong about the most fundamental assumption of her adult life. She had believed that love, opportunity, and significance were finite resources that ran out if not claimed in youth. She had learned instead that the human heart's capacity for new beginnings is inexhaustible, that the most profound partnerships often begin with the most unlikely circumstances, and that the most valuable legacy anyone can leave is proof that it's never too late to transform forgotten dreams into unforgettable realities. 6 cowboys had come seeking a wife. A forgotten woman had found a chosen family. Together, they had built not just a business empire, but a testament to the enduring power of hope, partnership, and the courage to believe that the best chapters of life might still be waiting to be written. In the end, Margaret Sullivan had learned the most important truth of all: the heart that dares to hope again, no matter how long it has been forgotten, can still create miracles that echo through generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.